Viktor Abakumov was the sadistic head of SMERSH. He didn't just sign death warrants, he personally beat prisoners bloody with a rubber truncheon in his own office. But in the end, Stalin turned on him. He was thrown into a freezing cell, tortured until he was paralyzed, and dragged to his execution. He died exactly as he lived, by violence. Viktor Semenovich Abakumov was born on April 24, 1908 in Moscow, into a world of soot, sweat, and desperate survival. His intellectual limitations and his reliance on brute force were forged by his origins. He was the son of a hospital stoker and a seamstress. In the social hierarchy of pre-revolutionary Russia, and even in the early days of the Soviet state, this was the bottom of the barrel. His father spent his days shoveling coal into furnaces, a life of physical exhaustion and grime. It was a hard, simple existence that valued muscle over mind, endurance over philosophy. Young Viktor grew up in a city that was rapidly disintegrating. His childhood coincided with the collapse of the Russian Empire, the horrors of World War I, and the bloody chaos of the Russian Civil War. He saw society ripped apart. He saw that the men who spoke eloquently in the Duma were swept away by the men who carried rifles in the streets. Education was a luxury he could not afford and did not value. He completed only 4 years of elementary school. By the age of 14, he was done with books. He would never read a complex political theory, never study history, never learn a foreign language. For the rest of his life, his handwriting would remain childlike, his grammar atrocious, and his reports filled with spelling errors. But in the new world being built by the Bolsheviks, this lack of education was not a liability. It was, in a twisted sense, an asset. The new regime distrusted the intelligentsia. They distrusted men who thought too much, who debated the nuances of Marxism. They needed men who did. They needed hands, not heads. At 14, Abakumov joined the Red Army. It was 1922, the end of the Civil War. The army became his surrogate family, his school, and his moral compass. Here, orders were absolute. You did not question, you executed. He learned that authority came from the uniform and the rank, not from debate. He was physically strong, aggressive, and eager to please his superiors. He was the perfect clay for the Soviet mold. He drifted through various minor roles in the bureaucracy during the 1920s, working in trade departments and warehouses, but these were just holding patterns. His true calling came in 1932 when he was recruited into the OGPU, the forerunner to the NKVD and the KGB. He was 24 years old. He was entering the secret police at a time when Stalin was beginning to tighten his grip on the country. Most historical accounts of the Soviet secret police focus on the true believers, the fanatics who killed because they believed they were building a utopia. Abakumov was not one of them. He was something far more dangerous, a careerist with no moral center. He didn't care about the dialectics of materialism. He cared about the leather coat, the special rations, the warmth of the office, and the fear in people's eyes. He was a thug who had found a government that legitimized thuggery. However, almost immediately, the cracks in his character began to show. And this is where the story takes a crucial turn that reveals the true nature of the Stalinist system. In 1933, just a year into his service as a security officer, Abakumov was caught in a scandal. It wasn't a political scandal. He hadn't been caught reading banned books or associating with Trotskyists. It was a scandal of common, vulgar corruption. As an operative, Abakumov had access to safe houses, secret apartments scattered around Moscow. These apartments were intended for clandestine meetings with informants, for running spies, for the grim business of state security. They were sacred spaces of the revolution's shield. But the young Abakumov saw them differently. To him, they were bachelor pads, paid for by the state. An internal investigation revealed that Abakumov was using these secret apartments to host drunken parties. He was bringing women back to these safe houses, women who had nothing to do with intelligence work. He was turning the infrastructure of the secret police into his personal brothel. Furthermore, he was embezzling operational funds. He was taking money meant to pay informants and using it to buy food, alcohol, and gifts for his mistresses. In any functioning intelligence agency in the world, this would be the end. It was a gross violation of security protocols, a misuse of funds, and a moral failing. He was exposing state secrets to random women for the sake of a good time. The investigation file was damning. The recommendation should have been expulsion, imprisonment, or perhaps, given the harshness of the times, a bullet. Looking for a specific psychological profile, brutal, ambitious, unburdened by intellect, and compromised by their past, he found the file of Viktor Abakumov. It was the perfect resume for a henchman. Abakumov was the son of a manual laborer, which ticked the box for proletarian origin. He was uneducated, which meant he wouldn't ask questions about Marxist theory. And he had that crucial stain on his record from 1933, the embezzlement and the sexual scandals, which meant he was vulnerable. Beria knew that a man with a dirty past is the most loyal dog of all, because he knows the master holds the leash. In December 1938, Abakumov was plucked from obscurity and appointed as the head of the NKVD for the Rostov region. It was a test. Rostov was a chaotic, violent region, and Beria wanted to see if his new protege had the stomach for industrial-scale repression. Abakumov did not disappoint. He turned Rostov into a slaughterhouse. He perfected a method of interrogation known as the conveyor. It was a simple, brutal, logistical innovation. Prisoners were not allowed to return to their cells. They were moved from one interrogator to another, hour after hour, day after day, without sleep, food, or water. The interrogators worked in shifts, the prisoners did not. Under this relentless pressure, accompanied by savage beatings that Abakumov often supervised or participated in, the human mind simply shattered. Everyone confessed. They confessed to being Japanese spies, British saboteurs, or Trotskyist conspirators. The truth was irrelevant. The quota was everything. Abakumov's success in Rostov was his ticket back to the center of power. Beria recalled him to Moscow to serve as the head of the directorate of the NKVD for Moscow itself. Now the stoker's son found himself sitting across the table from the very men who had once been the gods of the Soviet state. His primary task in this period was the purging of the old Chekists, the high-ranking officers who had served under Yezhov. These were men like Mikhail Franovsky and Boris Berman, men who considered themselves sophisticated revolutionaries. They spoke foreign languages. They had read Hegel and Marx. They had fought in the Civil War. They looked at the hulking, illiterate Abakumov with undisguised contempt. This class tension fueled Abakumov's violence. He hated the intelligentsia with a visceral passion. When he dragged these fallen idols into his interrogation room, he wasn't just extracting state secrets. He was exacting revenge for every moment he had felt inferior. He delighted in smashing the teeth of men who use big words. Witnesses from the time describe Abakumov during these sessions as a man possessed by a cold, arrogant energy. He would mock his prisoners, contrasting their former power with their current wretchedness. He would beat them with his heavy rubber truncheon, shouting that their education meant nothing, that their revolutionary history meant nothing. In Abakumov's world, The only truth was the physical reality of the boot and the fist. He successfully extracted confessions from the toughest executioners in Russia, proving to Stalin that he was a predator capable of eating other predators. Then came the morning of June 22, 1941. The German Wehrmacht smashed across the border. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The initial months of the war were a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. The Red Army collapsed. Millions of soldiers were encircled. By October 1941, German tanks were spotting the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Panic seized Moscow. On October 16th, the day of panic, officials burned documents in the streets, and the secret police began fleeing the city. But amidst this collapse, Abakumov found his true calling. As the structure of the state shook, Stalin turned to the secret police to hold the line, not against the Germans, but against the Soviet people. He feared that his own army would disintegrate or turn against him. Abakumov was placed in charge of the special departments, UOO, of the NKVD. These units were embedded within the military, acting as political commissars with the power of life and death. Abakumov's philosophy during the war was defined by Stalin's order number, 227, not a step back. Abakumov interpreted this literally and lethally. He organized the dreaded blocking detachments, Zagradotriads. These were units of well-fed, well-armed NKVD troops positioned directly behind the regular Red Army infantry. Their machine guns were not pointed at the Germans. They were pointed at the backs of their own Russian brothers. If a unit retreated without orders, if they broke under the terrifying barrage of German artillery, the blocking detachments were ordered to mow them down. Abakumov managed this machinery of fratricide with chilling efficiency. He traveled to the fronts, his massive frame squeezed into a staff car or a bomber, bringing the terror of Moscow to the trenches. But the outcome of the 1933 scandal defines the trajectory of Abakumov's life. He was not fired, he was not shot, he was simply transferred. His superiors decided that while he was morally loose, he was energetic and capable. They moved him from the prestigious economic directorate of the OGPU to the Gulag administration, the main administration of camps. He was sent to work as an operative in the prison camp system. While this might appear to be a punishment, in the Soviet hierarchy of the 1930s, it was merely a lateral move into the darker engine room of the economy. This transfer was arguably the most important education of Viktor Abakumov's life. If the Red Army had taught him discipline, the Gulag taught him the cheapness of human life. In the camps, he saw the raw reality of the police state. He saw how human beings were reduced to units of production. He learned that a prisoner was not a person with rights, but a resource to be exploited until expiration. He watched how the system broke men, how it stripped them of dignity, and how the strong survived by feeding on the weak. It was a world without pity, and Abakumov fit into it perfectly. He thrived in the brutality of the camps. He realized that in this system, morality was a weakness that got you killed. Ruthlessness was the virtue that got you promoted. Crucially, the 1933 scandal placed a permanent mark on his file. In a paradoxical way, this stain made him even more attractive to the higher-ups in the Kremlin. A man with a clean record might have principles. A man with a clean record might stand on his dignity. But a man with a dirty file, a man who had been caught stealing and whoring, that man was owned. That man was vulnerable. That man would do absolutely anything to prove his loyalty and keep his position. Stalin and his circle didn't want saints. Saints were troublesome. They wanted compromised men. They wanted men who knew that their entire existence depended on the whim of the master. Abakumov's corruption didn't disqualify him, it qualified him. It signaled that he was a tool that could be used, abused, and eventually discarded if necessary. So instead of destroying him, the scandal of 1933 hardened him. He emerged from his time in the Gulag administration with a clearer understanding of his role. He was not there to think. He was not there to be a moral arbiter. He was there to be a pair of hands that could strangle whatever neck he was pointed at. He cultivated the image of the simple, rough man of the people, the stoker's son, who hated the intellectuals, who hated the Jews, who hated anyone who used big words or wore glasses. He weaponized his own ignorance. By the late 1930s, the stage was set. The Great Terror was approaching. The old guard of the secret police, the intellectuals, the revolutionaries who had served under Lenin, were about to be wiped out. Stalin needed a new generation of executioners. He needed men who had no memory of the pre-revolutionary ideals, men who were purely creatures of the Stalinist present. He needed men like Viktor Abakumov, and Abakumov, hungry, ambitious, and utterly unburdened by conscience, was ready to step out of the shadows of the prison camps and into the blood-soaked spotlight of Moscow. He had learned his lesson well. In the Soviet Union, the only crime was getting caught without a protector, and he was determined never to be unprotected again. The year 1937 descended upon Moscow, not as a time period, but as a physical sensation, a suffocating blanket of dread that covered every street, every apartment block, and every government office. This was the height of the Yezhovshchina, the great terror orchestrated by the bloody dwarf, Nikolai Yezhov. It was a time when the black cars of the NKVD, the Voronki, prowled the city like sharks, devouring the Communist Party from the inside out. In this atmosphere of hysteria, where a wrong look or a whispered joke could lead to a bullet in the base of the skull, most men tried to become invisible. They shrank. They hid. But Viktor Abakumov did not hide. He saw the terror not as a tragedy, but as a ladder. His meteoric rise was fueled by the desperate crisis within the secret police itself. By late 1938, Joseph Stalin had decided that the executioners had done their work too well. Yezhov and his cadres were drunk on blood, unpredictable, and dangerous. They knew too many secrets. Stalin needed to liquidate the liquidators. He brought in Lavrenti Beria, the cunning, bespectacled technocrat from Georgia, to cleanse the NKVD. Beria arrived in Moscow with a specific problem. He could not trust the old guard of the secret police. He viewed the existing officers as Yezhov's men, tainted and treacherous. He needed new blood. He needed men who were culturally Russian to appease the masses, yet utterly subservient to him personally. He scanned the personnel files of the lower ranks. He wore immaculately tailored uniforms, doused himself in expensive cologne, and furnished his office with looted German furniture. He wanted to project an image of civilized power, but beneath the silk and the polish, the thug remained. It was during this time that Abakumov perfected the infrastructure of the filtration camps. As the Red Army pushed west, liberating territory occupied by the Nazis, they encountered millions of Soviet citizens, POWs who had survived German camps, civilians who had been taken as slave labor. Logic would dictate these people be treated as victims. But in the paranoid calculus of SMERSH, every person who had breathed air behind German lines was a potential traitor. Abakumov set up a vast network of screening centers. Hundreds of thousands of emaciated, traumatized survivors were funneled into these camps. Instead of doctors and food, they were met by Abakumov's interrogators. "Why didn't you die?" was the unspoken question. "Why did the Germans let you live? You must have collaborated. SMERSH operatives, under pressure to meet quotas set by Abakumov in Moscow, tortured these survivors into false confessions. Men who had endured the horrors of Auschwitz were beaten by their own countrymen until they admitted to being Gestapo agents. They were then shipped directly from the Nazi camps to the Soviet Gulag. Abakumov presided over this industrial recycling of human misery with cold detachment. He sent daily reports to Stalin, filled with statistics of spies caught, knowing that these numbers were the only metrics Stalin cared about. But Abakumov's cruelty wasn't just administrative, it was personal. He treated his headquarters like a torture dungeon from the Middle Ages. He kept a collection of instruments in his office. He was known to interrupt a meeting, go into an adjacent soundproofed room to beat a prisoner bloody, and then return to his desk to finish his tea, his knuckles bruised, dragging the smell of sweat and fear back into the meeting. He wanted his subordinates to know that he was not just an administrator, he was a practitioner. By the end of 1943, SMERSH had become a state within a state. The regular army feared them more than the Germans. The generals hated them but were powerless to stop them. And at the center of this web sat Viktor Abakumov, the stoker's son, twirling his rubber truncheon, believing that he had finally made himself indispensable to the Red Tsar. He didn't yet realize that in Stalin's world, the sharper the tool, the sooner it is broken. If the battlefield was the public face of the war, the interrogation room was its dark, private soul. And in this realm, Viktor Abakumov was not just an administrator, he was an inventor. He approached the destruction of the human spirit with the same meticulous attention to detail that an engineer applies to building a bridge. The true horror of SMERSH was not found on the maps or in grand strategies, but down the corridor in Abakumov's personal office at the Lubyanka, and later in the specialized chambers of the Sukhanovka prison, the place that Alexander Solzhenitsyn later called the most terrible prison in the MGB empire. Abakumov realized early in his career that traditional torture, the crude breaking of bones, had a flaw. It left marks. A prisoner with a crushed face could not be paraded in a show trial. A general with missing eyes could not be forced to sign a confession in front of a military tribunal without raising questions. Abakumov needed a method that inflicted maximum agony while leaving the victim looking superficially intact. He found his answer in the rubber truncheon. It became his signature. Unlike a wooden club or a metal pipe, hard rubber had a specific property. It damaged the tissue deep beneath the skin without necessarily breaking the surface. Abakumov developed and taught a specific curriculum of pain. He instructed his operatives to focus on two areas, the kidneys and the soles of the feet. The kidney strike was a science. A prisoner would be forced to kneel or bend over a chair. The interrogator would deliver rhythmic, heavy blows to the lower back. The pain was blinding, sickening. It caused internal hemorrhaging, blood in the urine, and long-term organ failure. But if done correctly, it left only deep bruising that could be hidden under a uniform. Then there was the falanga style, beating the soles of the bare feet. The feet are packed with nerve endings. A sustained beating there sends shock waves of agony through the entire nervous system, causing the brain to overload. The prisoner would be unable to walk, crawling back to their cell on hands and knees, yet their face remained untouched. But what truly separated Abakumov from other bureaucrats of terror was his personal involvement. He did not view torture as a dirty job to be delegated to sadists in the basement. He viewed it as a necessary form of intimacy between the state and the traitor. He didn't care about strategy or logistics. He cared about morale, which he equated with terror. He arrested generals who lost battles, accusing them of treason rather than incompetence. He arrested soldiers who complained about the lack of ammunition, accusing them of defeatist agitation. Under his watch, the special departments executed tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers. These were men who had volunteered to fight for their country, only to be shot by their country's secret police in a muddy ditch behind the lines. For Abakumov, the war was a clarifying experience. It stripped away the last pretenses of civilian law. There were no judges, no juries, no appeals. There was only the summary execution. He realized that war made him untouchable. As long as he delivered order, as long as he kept the army fighting through sheer terror, he was indispensable. He was no longer just Beria's thug. He was becoming the Grim Reaper of the Red Army, a man whose name was whispered with more fear in the trenches than the name of Hitler. By the spring of 1943, the smell of burning flesh and frozen mud that had defined Stalingrad began to fade, replaced by the cautious optimism of victory. The German Sixth Army had been annihilated. The myth of Nazi invincibility lay broken on the banks of the Volga. But in the corridors of the Kremlin, victory brought a new, darker anxiety for Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a student of history, and he knew that successful wars breed dangerous generals. He looked at his marshals, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, and he saw men who were becoming larger than life. They were covered in glory. The soldiers worshiped them. What if after crushing Berlin they decided to march on Moscow? What if a Soviet Napoleon arose from the ashes of the war to depose the party? Stalin realized that the NKVD, still under the control of the ambitious Lavrenti Beria, was becoming too powerful a monolith. If Beria aligned with the military, Stalin would be finished. He needed to fracture the power structures. He needed a dedicated weapon to hold a knife to the throat of the military, a weapon that answered only to him. On April 19, 1943, inside the high-ceilinged, tobacco-stained office of the Supreme Commander, a decision was made that would scar the soul of the nation. Stalin issued a secret decree separating the special departments from the NKVD. He was creating a new, independent intelligence service dedicated solely to military counterintelligence. The draft proposal for the new organization's name was placed on Stalin's desk, SMERSH, an acronym for Smert Nemetskim Spionam, death to German spies. Stalin, puffing on his pipe, looked at the paper with disdain. He looked up at his advisors and asked a question that revealed the depth of his paranoia. Why should we limit ourselves only to German spies? Are there no other spies? What about the British? What about the Americans? What about the internal enemies? With a stroke of his thick blue pencil, he crossed out German. He shortened the name to a single guttural sound that evoked the snapping of a bone. SMERSH, Smert, Spionam, death to spies. It was more than a name. It was a mission statement. It declared that the Soviet Union was at war with the world, and that the enemy could be anyone, anywhere. To lead this new beast, Stalin bypassed the intellectuals and the career bureaucrats. He chose Viktor Abakumov. And in a masterstroke of political maneuvering, Stalin elevated Abakumov's status to a level that shocked the Soviet hierarchy. As the head of SMERSH, Abakumov would no longer report to Beria. He would report directly to the People's Commissar of Defense, Stalin himself. This was the moment of Abakumov's true ascension. He was 35 years old, and he was now arguably the second most terrifying man in the empire. He had his own budget, his own prisons, and his own army of operatives. He established his headquarters at 13 Lubyanka Square, separate from the main NKVD building, creating a physical distance from his former boss, Beria. Abakumov built SMERSH to be a wolfhound, lean, aggressive, and relentless. While its official mandate was to root out foreign agents, its practical application was the total surveillance of the Red Army. Abakumov instituted a system where SMERSH operatives were gods within their assigned regiments. A 20-year-old SMERSH lieutenant had the authority to arrest a colonel in the middle of a battle planning session. They could pull a soldier out of a tank and execute him for anti-Soviet intent without consulting the military commanders. The culture of SMERSH reflected Abakumov's own personality, vain, brutal, and obsessed with dominance. He designed the service to be elitist. SMERSH officers were paid better than regular army officers. They were given the best rations, the best boots, and the license to act with impunity. Abakumov himself began to adopt the airs of a potentate. Witnesses who survived encounters with Abakumov describe a scene of chilling dissonance. He would be sitting in his opulent office, dressed in a pristine general's tunic, smelling of expensive cologne. He would speak politely at first, but the moment a prisoner hesitated, the mask would drop. Abakumov would stand up, a looming athletic giant, and reach for the truncheon he kept on his desk like a paperweight. He called this active interrogation. He would beat the prisoners himself, sweating with exertion, his face flushed with the adrenaline of violence. There are accounts of Abakumov beating high-ranking officials, men he had known socially, men he had dined with. He would smash them to the floor, shouting obscenities, accusing them of betraying the motherland. Then when the session was over, he would calmly wash his hands, straighten his tunic, and return to his paperwork, leaving the moaning wreck of a human being to be dragged away by guards. This personal participation served a psychological purpose. It terrified his subordinates. If the minister himself was willing to bloody his hands, what excuse did a mere lieutenant have for being soft? It created a culture of extreme violence that trickled down from the top. Every SMERSH interrogator knew that active measures were not just permitted, they were expected. Abakumov also utilized the conveyor method, a technique inherited from the NKVD but refined by SMERSH. It was an assault on time and biology. A prisoner would be interrogated for 24, 48, sometimes 72 hours straight. The interrogators worked in shifts. As one team grew tired, a fresh team would enter, rested and aggressive. The prisoner was never allowed to sleep. If they nodded off, they were beaten awake. The result was a total disintegration of reality. After 3 days without sleep, the brain begins to hallucinate. The line between memory and suggestion blurs. A prisoner would sign anything just to be allowed to close their eyes. They would admit to plotting to kill Stalin. They would admit to being a Martian spy. They would admit to crimes that were physically impossible. For Abakumov, the truth was irrelevant. He was running a factory. His product was confessions, and business was booming. While Abakumov was perfecting his laboratory of pain in Moscow, a tragedy of epic proportions was unfolding across the liberated territories of Eastern Europe. This was the filtration, a bureaucratic euphemism for one of the greatest betrayals in military history. By 1944 and 1945, the Red Army was rolling into Germany. They were liberating concentration camps. They were finding hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers who had been captured in 1941 and 1942, men who had survived the starvation and brutality of Nazi camps. These men were skeletons, clinging to life, weeping with joy at the sight of the red star on the tanks. They thought they were saved. They thought they were going home to their mothers and wives. They were wrong. They were going to Viktor Abakumov. Stalin's view on prisoners of war was infamously cruel. There are no prisoners of war. he had said. There are only traitors. In his mind, a true Soviet soldier should save the last bullet for himself. Surrender was treason. Therefore, anyone who had survived German captivity was suspect. Had they been turned? Had they been recruited by the Gestapo? Abakumov's SMERSH was tasked with filtering this mass of humanity. They set up camps that were strikingly similar to the Nazi camps that had just been liberated. Barbed wire, watchtowers, guards with dogs. The interrogation process was ruthless. A soldier who had survived 3 years of Nazi starvation was now stripped bare and interrogated by a well-fed SMERSH officer. "Why are you alive?" the officer would ask. I just survived," the soldier would stammer. "Liar. The Germans don't feed useless mouths. You must have worked for them. Who did you betray?" Abakumov demanded quotas. The presumption of guilt was absolute. Hundreds of thousands of these soldiers were stripped of their ranks, branded as traitors and shipped directly to the Kolyma mines, or the Siberian Gulag. They went from one hell to another, the only difference being the language spoken by the guards. Abakumov presided over this destruction of a generation with cold efficiency. To him, these were not heroes. They were contaminated material. But Abakumov didn't just target the helpless foot soldiers. He aimed his weapon at the very top. He knew that Stalin feared his own generals. The victory over Germany had made men like Zhukov and his inner circle incredibly popular. They were arrogant with glory. They felt untouchable. Abakumov began a campaign of surveillance that would have made the Gestapo envious. He bugged the apartments, the dachas, and the hotel rooms of the Soviet military elite. He was looking for a specific kind of crime, anti-Soviet conversation. The case of Colonel General Vasily Gordov is the definitive example of Abakumov's method. Gordov was a hero of the Soviet Union, a man who had commanded the Stalingrad front. He was brave, blunt, and disillusioned. He felt that after winning the war, the Russian people deserved a better life, not more repression. Abakumov's technicians installed microphones in Gordov's private apartment. They recorded him speaking to his wife and his fellow officers. Gordov, believing he was safe in his own home, poured out his heart. He criticized the poverty of the peasantry. He complained that Stalin was taking all the credit for the war. He said, "We have destroyed one dictator only to strengthen another." Abakumov took these transcripts directly to Stalin. He didn't contextualize them as the venting of a tired soldier. He presented them as evidence of a brewing coup. Gordov was arrested. So were his colleagues, Marshal Kulik and General Rybalchenko. They were not given a public trial. That would be too dangerous, as the public loved them. They were taken to Abakumov's dungeons. Here, the tragedy came full circle. These men, who had faced down German panzers, were now stripped of their uniforms and beaten by Abakumov's thugs. They were tortured for months. Abakumov wanted them to confess to a vast military conspiracy. He wanted to give Stalin the pretext to purge the entire army leadership, just as he had done in 1937. Gordov and his colleagues were eventually shot. Their families were told they had died of heart failure or were simply never told anything at all. It was a war within the war. While the Red Army was fighting to destroy fascism, Abakumov was fighting to destroy the Red Army's soul. He was ensuring that no one, no matter how many medals they wore, could ever feel safe. He was proving that the only true power in the Soviet Union was the power to inflict pain. This campaign against the military solidified Abakumov's position as Stalin's favorite attack dog. He had delivered the heads of the generals. He had purified the returning POWs. He stood atop a pyramid of broken bodies, believing he was invincible. But he had forgotten the most basic rule of the jungle he inhabited. The predator who grows too fat and too confident eventually becomes the prey. And in the shadows of the Kremlin, new enemies were already sharpening their knives. The year 1946 marked the apotheosis of Viktor Abakumov. The war was over, the ashes of Europe were cooling, and the Soviet Union was restructuring itself for a new era of totalitarian control. In a move that signaled the absolute primacy of the secret police, the old NKVD was split. The policing of the streets and the running of the Gulag were relegated to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD. But the crown jewel, the intelligence work, the counter-espionage, the political surveillance, the power to arrest the elite, was given to a new entity, the Ministry of State Security, the MGB. At the head of this terrifying new organ stood Viktor Abakumov. He was no longer just a butcher in a basement. He was a minister of the Soviet Union. At 38 years old, the stoker's son had reached a height of power that was almost incomprehensible. He was, for all intents and purposes, the second most dangerous man in the Eastern Hemisphere, answerable only to Joseph Stalin himself. This period reveals the grotesque disconnect between the Soviet reality and the life of its enforcers. While the Russian people were starving, living in the ruins of bombed-out cities, rationing bread, and queuing for hours for a bar of soap, Abakumov was living like a decadent prince. He moved into a luxurious apartment in Moscow, seizing property that had once belonged to the very victims he had purged. He requisitioned a dacha in the exclusive suburbs, turning it into a fortress of leisure. He became obsessed with the trappings of status. The rough, leather-jacketed Chekist of the 1930s was gone. In his place was a man who ordered custom-tailored suits from the finest fabrics, who wore imported silk underwear, and who doused himself in French cologne. Abakumov's corruption was legendary, even by Soviet standards. During the occupation of Germany, he had treated the conquered nation as his personal shopping mall. He used military transport planes that should have been carrying medicine or food, to fly trophy art back to Moscow. He filled his homes with looted German furniture, porcelain, tapestries, and gold. He built a private tennis court and forced his subordinates to play with him, terrified that beating the minister would result in a transfer to Siberia, while losing too badly might insult him. He hosted lavish parties where the tables groaned under the weight of caviar, sturgeon, and endless bottles of Georgian cognac. While outside the windows, the population subsisted on potato peels. He used his position to prey on women, leveraging the fear of arrest to coerce actresses and the wives of subordinates into his bed. He was a man gorging himself on the carcass of the victory. But this luxury did not soften him. It made him more arrogant. He began to believe his own myth. He started to treat other members of the Politburo with barely concealed disdain. He knew he held their files. He knew what they whispered in their bedrooms. He felt untouchable because he was the shield of Stalin. His relationship with Stalin during these years was intense and dangerous. Abakumov was one of the few people who had daily access to the boss. He knew how to manipulate the aging dictator. He knew that Stalin, now approaching 70, was becoming increasingly frail and paranoid. Stalin didn't want complex geopolitical analysis. He wanted confirmation of his suspicions. Abakumov fed him a diet of fabricated plots and exaggerated threats. If Stalin frowned at a particular minister, Abakumov would have a dossier on that minister's anti-Soviet activities ready by the next morning. This arrogance, however, created powerful enemies. Lavrenti Beria, his former mentor, watched Abakumov's rise with cold reptilian jealousy. Beria saw Abakumov not just as a rival, but as a usurper who had stolen his security apparatus. Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's deputy, also feared Abakumov's unchecked power. They saw a man who was becoming a state within a state. They began to whisper in the shadows, waiting for the giant to stumble. But Abakumov didn't stumble. He marched. He expanded the MGB's reach into every crevice of Soviet life. He purged the scientific community. He purged the literary journals. He purged the jazz musicians. He created an atmosphere where fear was the only oxygen. In the Ministry of Fear, Abakumov was the undisputed king, and he believed his reign would last forever. He did not see that the higher he built his pedestal, the more unstable the ground beneath it became. If the purge of the military was Abakumov's war on the heroes of the battlefield, the Leningrad affair of 1949 was his war on the future of the Soviet Union. It remains the bloodiest and most senseless political massacre of the post-war era, a masterclass in fabrication that destroyed the brightest minds of a generation. The context was simple: jealousy. During the war, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, had endured a 900-day siege. The city had starved, frozen, and bled, but it had never surrendered. This heroism created a unique political identity. The leaders of Leningrad, men like Andrei Zhdanov, Nikolai Voznesensky, and Alexei Kuznetsov, were viewed as saviors. They were younger, charismatic, and competent. They represented a new energy, a potential successor generation to the aging Stalin and his cronies. Stalin hated them for it. He hated their independence. He hated that they had survived without his direct help. He feared that Leningrad was becoming a rival power center to Moscow. In 1948, Andrei Zhdanov, the protector of the Leningrad group, died of a heart attack, a death that remains suspicious to this day. With their shield gone, the wolves moved in. Malenkov and Beria wanted the Leningraders gone to eliminate competition for Stalin's succession. They whispered to Stalin that Leningrad was plotting a separatist movement, that they wanted to break away from the USSR and form a new government. It was an absurd lie, but it was exactly the kind of lie Abakumov was born to operationalize. Stalin gave the order, "Destroy the Leningrad nest." Abakumov descended on the city like an avenging angel. He didn't just arrest a few people, he dismantled the entire party structure of the second largest city in the empire. Thousands of officials, managers, and party members were arrested. But the centerpiece of this tragedy was the destruction of Nikolai Voznesensky. Voznesensky was the head of Gosplan, the state planning committee, and a deputy premier. He was a brilliant economist, arguably the most intelligent man in the Soviet leadership. He was widely seen as Stalin's potential heir. Abakumov personally oversaw the destruction of this intellectual giant. Voznesensky was arrested and dragged to the Lefortovo prison. Abakumov knew that breaking a man of Voznesensky's stature required more than just pain. It required humiliation. The interrogation transcripts and survivor accounts paint a picture of medieval cruelty. Abakumov, the uneducated thug who had barely finished primary school, took immense pleasure in destroying the brilliant economist. He would mock Voznesensky's theories while his men beat him. They used the stand conveyor method. Voznesensky was forced to stand in a designated square on the floor for days on end. If he slumped, he was beaten. His legs swelled until his boots had to be cut off. He was denied sleep until he was delirious. Abakumov wanted a confession that the Leningrad leadership was actually a nest of British spies plotting to blow up the Kremlin. Voznesensky, a devout communist who had dedicated his life to the system, initially refused to sign such insanity. So, Abakumov escalated. He ordered the arrest of Voznesensky's family. He threatened to bring Voznesensky's wife and children into the room and torture them in front of him. This was Abakumov's trump card. He knew that even the strongest man will break to save his children. Broken, weeping, and hallucinating, Voznesensky signed the confession. He signed his own death warrant and that of his colleagues. The finale of this tragedy took place in September 1950. It was a secret trial, held in the officer's house in Leningrad, the very same building where Abakumov himself would face judgment 4 years later. It was a farce. There were no defense attorneys. There was no evidence other than the confessions extracted under torture. Voznesensky, Kuznetsov, and the other leaders of Leningrad were sentenced to death. They were shot immediately after the verdict. Their bodies were dumped in unmarked graves in the Levashovo wasteland. But Abakumov wasn't finished. The execution of the leaders was just the beginning. He launched a wave of secondary purges. The wives of the executed men were sent to the Gulag. Their children were thrown into orphanages. Their names changed to erase their lineage. The purge extended to the universities, the libraries, and the museums of Leningrad. Anyone who had been associated with the Leningrad clique was hunted down. Abakumov had delivered exactly what Stalin wanted: a decapitated rival city. He had eliminated the only competent successors who could have led the Soviet Union into a more modern era. In doing so, he solidified the stagnation that would eventually rot the empire from within. He stood over the graves of the Leningrad leadership and believed he had won. He had pleased the master. He had destroyed the enemies of Malenkov and Beria, or so he thought. He didn't realize that by demonstrating such ruthless efficiency, he had terrified his allies as much as his victims. Malenkov and Beria looked at the fate of Voznesensky, a deputy premier tortured and shot, and they realized a chilling truth. If Abakumov could do that to Voznesensky, he could do it to them. The Leningrad affair was Abakumov's greatest professional success, but it was also the moment his death warrant was silently drafted by the men standing in the shadows behind Stalin's chair. He had become too dangerous to live. While internal purges consumed the party leadership, Abakumov also turned his gaze outward. By the dawn of 1950, the geopolitical landscape had shifted tectonically, transforming the Cold War into a furnace of open conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and for Viktor Abakumov, this war offered a singular opportunity to expand the dominion of the MGB from domestic repression to global espionage. While the world watched the sweeping movements of T-34 tanks and the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter, Abakumov was orchestrating a clandestine war that ran beneath the surface of the visible conflict. A campaign driven not by territorial conquest, but by a voracious hunger for technological secrets and psychological dominance. Stalin had issued a directive that was as precise as it was difficult. The Soviet Union needed to possess the secrets of American air superiority, specifically the F-86 Sabre, a jet fighter that had shocked the Kremlin with its speed and agility. Abakumov did not send soldiers to fulfill this order. He sent trophy teams, elite units of technical intelligence officers disguised in Chinese or North Korean uniforms who moved like phantoms through the chaos of the front lines, tasked with the grim salvage of crashed American aircraft and the even darker task of hunting living pilots. The operational reality of Abakumov's intelligence war in Korea was a testament to the ruthless efficiency of the machine he had built. When an American jet was downed, a race against time ensued in the mud and snow of the Korean hills. If American rescue teams arrived first, the pilot was saved. But if Abakumov's operatives reached the crash site, the pilot ceased to be a prisoner of war and became a raw intelligence asset to be mined for data. Declassified files from the Venona project and subsequent historical investigations have revealed the harrowing fate of men like Colonel Frank Schwabel and Lieutenant Kenneth Enoch, who were dragged into a shadow world where the Geneva Convention was treated as a bourgeois fiction. These pilots were transported across the Yalu River into specialized interrogation facilities in Manchuria or the Soviet Union itself, facilities designed by Abakumov to break the human will without leaving the physical scars that would spark an international incident. The interrogation methodology was a chilling refinement of the techniques used in the Lubyanka. Men were subjected to the cold treatment, left stripped of their clothing in unheated pits during the sub-zero Korean winter until hypothermia brought them to the edge of death, only to be revived, warmed, and interrogated again in a cycle of calculated agony designed to shatter their psychological defenses. However, Abakumov's ambitions in Korea extended far beyond the theft of avionics or radar frequencies. He was the architect of one of the most audacious and cynical disinformation campaigns of the 20th century, the allegation that the United States was deploying biological weapons against the population of North Korea. This was a lie of breathtaking scale, a fabrication entirely manufactured in the offices of the MGB to humiliate the United States on the world stage. Yet Abakumov understood that a lie of this magnitude required proof in the form of human testimony. He personally directed the extraction of false confessions from captured American airmen, sending detailed cables from Moscow that instructed his interrogators to force the prisoners to invent technical details about bacteriological bombs and infected insects. The pilots, broken by months of isolation and physical degradation, eventually capitulated and signed the scripts written by Abakumov's dramatists, confessing to crimes that had never occurred. When these confessions were broadcast to the world and read aloud at the United Nations, sparking anti-American riots from Paris to Tokyo, it was a triumph of active measures, proving that Abakumov could bend global public perception through the precise application of pain in a dark cell thousands of miles away. While Abakumov was successfully managing a global shadow war, the ground beneath his feet in Moscow was beginning to crumble, rotted away by the toxic atmosphere of a Kremlin that was suffocating under the weight of Joseph Stalin's final, senile paranoia. By 1951, the dictator was a dying man, 72 years old, and ravaged by atherosclerosis, a condition that restricted blood flow to the brain and exacerbated his lifelong suspicion into a delusional mania. Stalin had become convinced that he was surrounded by assassins, believing that the very doctors sworn to protect his health were actually agents of a vast Zionist conspiracy plotting to poison the Soviet leadership with incorrect medical treatments. In this fevered climate, reality ceased to matter. The only thing that mattered was validating the dictator's nightmares. And this was where Viktor Abakumov, usually so astute in the arts of survival, made the fatal error of pragmatism. He investigated the initial rumors of a doctor's plot, saw that they were baseless fabrications without a shred of evidence, and essentially ignored them, failing to realize that Stalin did not want the truth. He wanted a witch hunt. This moment of hesitation exposed Abakumov's flank to the one danger he had underestimated, the simmering resentment of his own subordinates. Mikhail Ryumin, a senior investigator in the MGB, was a man Abakumov had frequently humiliated, calling him a midget and mocking his intellect in front of the department's elite. Ryumin was a creature of pure ambition and zero morality, and he saw in Stalin's obsession with the Jewish doctors a golden opportunity to destroy the giant who cast such a long shadow over his career. Reumann seized upon the case of Dr. Yakov Ittinger, a prominent Jewish cardiologist who had died in MGB custody during an interrogation, a routine occurrence in Abakumov's brutal system that had been filed away and forgotten. Reumann, however, resurrected the file and weaponized it, bypassing the chain of command to write a secret letter directly to Stalin, a letter that was a masterpiece of bureaucratic assassination. In this explosive denunciation, Reumann spun a fantastical narrative, claiming that Dr. Ettinger had actually confessed to the Zionist plot to kill Soviet leaders, and that Abakumov, acting as a secret protector of the Jewish conspiracy, had deliberately ordered Ettinger's death in prison to silence the key witness and bury the evidence. It was an absurd lie that defied logic. Abakumov was a known anti-Semite who had ruthlessly purged Jews from his own ministry, but it fit perfectly into the jigsaw puzzle of Stalin's paranoia. When Stalin received the letter, it confirmed his darkest suspicions that the rot had spread to the very head of the secret police. On July 4, 1951, a commission was formed not to investigate the truth, but to formalize the execution of a political sentence, with Stalin declaring to the Politburo with icy certainty that Abakumov is either too naive or he has been bought. The end came with the sudden violence of a trap springing shut on July 12, 1951. Abakumov was summoned to a meeting, likely expecting a discussion on the Korean War or a new directive on domestic surveillance, walking into the room with the swagger of a minister of state security who believed himself untouchable. Instead, he was met by the steely gaze of Malenkov and the gleeful eyes of his rivals. He was stripped of his weapon, stripped of his rank, and handcuffed by men who had previously trembled at his footsteps. The transition from the ultimate predator to a helpless victim was instantaneous and total. As he was dragged toward the heavy doors of the Lefortovo prison, the very dungeon he had filled with thousands of innocent victims, Abakumov must have realized with a sickening clarity that the system he had served so loyally had finally turned its appetite upon him. He was now the prisoner of Mikhail Reumin, the midget he had tormented, who now held the keys to the cell and the rubber truncheon that Abakumov himself had made the symbol of state power. The descent of Viktor Abakumov from the plush offices of the ministry into the bowels of Lefortovo prison was a journey into a hell of his own design, a place where the cruelty he had institutionalized was now turned upon his own body with a vengeful precision. He was thrown into the special zone of the prison, isolated from the world he once terrified, and placed under the direct supervision of Mikhail Reumin, the former subordinate whose ambition Abakumov had mocked. Reumin approached the interrogation of his former boss not as a duty, but as a personal vendetta, eager to prove his loyalty to Stalin by breaking the man who was once considered unbreakable. The sessions were brutal and relentless, stripping away the veneer of the arrogant general to reveal the vulnerable flesh beneath. Reumin utilized the full spectrum of MGB torture techniques, including the notorious conveyor of sleep deprivation and savage beatings with the rubber truncheon, focusing on the kidneys and spine, just as Abakumov had taught his men to do. But Reumin introduced a specific horror that Abakumov had often reserved for his most stubborn victims: the freezing cell. Abakumov was stripped of his warm clothing and locked in a specially designed isolation cell where the temperature was artificially lowered to sub-zero levels. He was left there for hours, shivering violently, his body turning blue, the cold gnawing at his bones, until the pain became a delirious fugue state. When he was dragged out, barely conscious, he was beaten again. The physical toll was catastrophic. Within months, the once imposing giant was reduced to a crippled wreck. His spine was damaged so severely that he lost the use of his legs, dragging himself across the floor of his cell like a wounded animal, while his body became covered in festering ulcers from lying on the freezing stone and the rough prison cot without medical attention. Yet, amidst this physical disintegration, Abakumov waged a desperate psychological war for survival. He understood the script of the show trial better than anyone else alive. He knew that if he confessed to the primary charge that he was a Zionist spy working for American intelligence, he would be shot within 24 hours. Therefore, he adopted a strategy of calculated obstinacy. He freely admitted to being a brute. He admitted to embezzling state funds, and he admitted to beating prisoners. But he steadfastly refused to sign the confession stating he was a foreign agent. This was a gamble of supreme cynicism. Abakumov knew that Stalin was dying, and he reasoned that if he could just endure the pain and keep breathing until the dictator passed, the political winds might shift and save his life. He was buying time with his own suffering, enduring the freezing cell and the truncheon day after day, waiting for the news that the Red Tsar was dead. Abakumov's grim gamble partially paid off in March 1953 when Joseph Stalin finally died, throwing the Soviet Union into a chaotic power struggle. But he quickly discovered that survival in the post-Stalin world was just as treacherous as life under the dictator. Lavrenti Beria briefly seized control and arrested Mikhail Ryumin, executing the man who had tortured Abakumov. Yet Beria did not release Abakumov. He knew that the former Minister of State Security knew too many secrets, specifically where the bodies of the Great Terror were buried, making him a liability to everyone in the new leadership. Abakumov remained rotting in his cell while the Kremlin sharks devoured each other, until finally Nikita Khrushchev emerged victorious and decided that he needed a scapegoat to absolve the party of the crimes of the recent past. Abakumov was the perfect candidate, a man hated by the army, feared by the people, and already broken in prison. In December 1954, the final act of this tragedy was staged not in Moscow, but in Leningrad, a deliberate symbolic choice to hold the trial at the scene of Abakumov's greatest crime, the Leningrad affair. The venue was the officer's house, a grand neoclassical building that was converted into a closed courtroom for a trial that was designed to be a piece of political theater rather than a judicial proceeding. When the guards brought the defendant into the room, a hush fell over the assembled military officers and party officials. The man before them was unrecognizable. Abakumov could not walk. He was practically carried by guards or wheeled in. A chaotic heap of broken bones and ruined health, his face gray and gaunt, looking 20 years older than his 46 years. The trial lasted from December 14th to December 19th, but the verdict had been written before the first gavel fell. Abakumov was charged not just with the Leningrad affair, but with being a bourgeois nationalist and a traitor, charges that were a mix of truth and political fabrication. When allowed to speak, the broken man did not beg for mercy, nor did he express remorse for the thousands of lives he had destroyed. Instead, he offered the only defense that a man of his nature could understand, a defense that indicted the entire Soviet system. He looked at his judges and rasped, "Stalin gave the orders. I only executed them. I was merely the instrument of the will of the Central Committee." It was the absolute truth. He had been a hammer in the hand of the state, but it was a truth the court could not accept. For to acquit Abakumov was to admit that the party itself was criminal. The survival of the system required that the executioner die alone, taking the sins of the era with him into the grave. At 12:15 p.m. on December 19, 1954, the inevitable verdict was read: death by shooting. The Soviet machinery of death did not believe in long goodbyes. Just 1 hour later, the former minister was dragged from the courtroom. Crippled and broken, unable to stand, Abakumov was carried to the wall like a sack of waste. A single 7.62 millimeter bullet to the back of the head ended the life of the stoker's son, extinguishing the brain that had concocted the Leningrad affair. The main stick of Joseph Stalin was broken and tossed onto the ash heap of history. The disposal of Viktor Abakumov's remains was the final perfect irony of his existence. There was no funeral, no marker, and no record of burial. It is widely believed that his body was trucked to the Levashovo Memorial Cemetery, a desolate stretch of wasteland north of Leningrad that served as a mass grave for the victims of the Great Terror. Here, in the silence of the pine forest, the ground is lumpy with the bones of over 45,000 people, aristocrats, poets, scientists, priests, and simple workers who were murdered by the NKVD and the MGB. Abakumov was likely dumped into a pit alongside the very people he had ordered killed, his ashes mingling with the victims of his own filtration camps and purge trials. He vanished into the anonymous earth, denied even the dignity of a name on a stone, erased from the world just as effectively as he had erased the enemies of the people during his reign of terror. The legacy of Viktor Abakumov is a haunting void, a story of injustice that offers no closure and no moral comfort. His death did not bring back the dead, it did not restore the careers of the ruined generals, or heal the broken bodies of the tortured dissidents. It was merely a bureaucratic correction, a cleaning of the house by men like Khrushchev, who were anxious to bury the past so they could secure their own future. The execution of Abakumov was not an act of justice. It was an act of political hygiene. He was killed not because he was a monster, but because he was a monster who knew too much, a liability who reminded the new leaders of the blood on their own hands. As the snow began to fall on the unmarked graves of Levashovo, covering both the innocent and the guilty in a blanket of uniform white, history moved on with a terrifying indifference, leaving us with the chilling realization that in a totalitarian system, the line between the executioner and the victim is not drawn in ink but in blood, and it can be redrawn at any moment by the man holding the gun.